Joining us now, professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude Jr., and best-selling author and staff writer for The Atlantic, George Packer. George is out with a new piece entitled, "We Are Living in a Failed State. The Coronavirus Didn't Break America. It Revealed What Was Already Broken." George writes this, quote, "When the virus came here, it found a country with serious underlying conditions, and it exploited them ruthlessly. Chronic ills, a corrupt political class, a sclerotic bureaucracy, a heartless economy, a divided and distracted public had gone untreated for years." Good morning to you both. George, I'll start with you right there in that piece. A lot of people have pointed out that this has shined a light on the goodness, the fundamental goodness of the American people, and no question it has. And we've seen that among regular people and the heroes working in our hospitals and on the front lines. But it has also shined a light on our vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, I've been as heartened as everyone by the sacrifice and the generosity of ordinary people across the country. And it's also heartening to see that there does seem to be an emerging consensus that is stronger maybe than some of the partisan divisions that we've known for years, that science should be our guide in this. But I can never forget those weeks in March, and they really are continuing now in April, when we looked to our national government for guidance, for instructions, for basic information, and it wasn't there. And it reminded me, we're not a textbook failed state. I've reported from a few failed states, and that's not us. The police are functioning. When you call 911, an ambulance will come. But our national government was in chaos and was dissembling and deceiving us and was unable to provide either information or help when we desperately needed it. And it reminded me a little bit of what it's like for citizens to find that when they look to their national leaders in a crisis, they find that no one's there and they have to make decisions on their own without that guidance.
And George, as you know and as you've reported on, there have been many failures of government over the last generation. You can go through the intelligence failures leading up to 9/11, the financial crisis of 2008. We can add Katrina in there as well. So this is not a new problem in the United States, but is there something unique about this particular problem and the way this government has handled it?
If you use the health metaphor, our body politic today is much weaker than it was on 9/11, and even weaker than it was in 2008 during the financial crisis and the beginning of the Great Recession. We're now more polarized, more divided. Our government has been demoralized by constant attack from within and without. It's been defunded, and our economy in some ways is more unequal now than at any time in the last 40 years when inequality has been a growing problem. So all of those symptoms made us an easy target for coronavirus to really wreak havoc in our society. And so I think what's different now is the virus is more personal, more intimate, and also more broad scale than either the recession or 9/11. And our response is weaker because for years we've allowed these ills to go untreated. And now with leadership in Washington that almost seems at times to be collaborating with the virus. I compared Trump, who has called himself a wartime president, to the French General Marshal Pétain, who was in charge when the Nazis invaded and who essentially gave up and allowed them to occupy the country and created his own Vichy Republic. So it's a harsh comparison, but at times Trump seems to be collaborating with the virus and doing its work for it. So all of those things have made us a much easier target. And recovery is going to be much harder this time around than in those earlier crises that you mentioned, Willie.
Yeah, that's an extreme comparison, obviously. Eddie, I want to ask you about the vulnerable people in all of this. We know physically vulnerable from a health standpoint. We know who's vulnerable there, but also the economically vulnerable, the socioeconomically vulnerable, the culturally vulnerable, the people that this virus has attacked in particular.
I really enjoyed George's piece in The Atlantic, really, because on one level, what he said and what he argued is that what we're witnessing is the collapse of an entire or a whole way of governing, because the virus has revealed the growing gap, and I'm quoting him here, the growing gap between triumphant capital and beleaguered labor. So all of the fissures, the breakages within our society, that's where the virus lives. And it's feeding on people. And what we see over and over again is that the most vulnerable pre-corona, right, are in some ways the most vulnerable during corona and will be the most vulnerable post-corona if they survive. And so part of what I want to say, as the president and all of his minions talk about opening the society to folks who are in my community particularly, I want you to understand this as an invitation to the grave, that what Donald Trump is saying by not talking about robust testing, by not addressing the inequalities that in some ways define our country, as George has brilliantly laid out in his piece, in some ways, he's inviting, creating the conditions for more death, But I think it's important, and I should say this really quickly, that the way in which George lays out his argument, there have been choices made in order to produce this particular situation. Of course, we didn't choose the coronavirus, but we've made choices to provide an environment where the coronavirus thrives. And I want to underscore this. We're choosing mass unemployment. We're choosing not to test at the federal level. We're making choices, and those choices are predicated, in my view, Willie, on a political ideology that is driven in so many ways by just unadulterated greed. And the result is suffering. And we just need to tell the truth about it.
We want to thank George Packer with The Atlantic. We'll be reading your latest piece. George, love to get you back. Your shot, we're having a little trouble with your shot, but please come back because I want to ask you tomorrow or maybe on Monday what I'm about to ask Eddie Glaude. So, Eddie, I understand the New York Times this morning has a piece talking about American exceptionalism in doubt. It reminds me of what happened in 2008 after the crash and all the companies were going down. And Warren Buffett said, you know what? If you bet against the United States of America, you're going to lose every time. He piled a ton of money into companies and made a ton of money. I understand we have a failed leader. I understand Washington, D.C. has failed the American people throughout the better part of this century. The infighting has just been absolutely awful. But let's take a little bit closer look at the United States of America. We have the best scientists. We have the best doctors. We have the best universities. This isn't jingoism. We've got the most Nobel Prize winners. We've got the best tech companies. We are still the innovators. We still are the leaders on the cutting edge in just about every area when it comes to science and when it comes to technology, when it comes to all these, which actually makes our failure in this crisis, which makes Washington's failure in this crisis even worse. I will say that one other thing, too. Not only do we have that going for us, Eddie, let's just stop for 1 second. I'd love to get your reaction to the fact that Americans together have been responsible and for the most part have been staying at home, have been socially distancing, have acted responsibly together, and we bent that curve a lot faster than the experts expected, right? And then if you look at the polls that came out over the past week, whether it's the Pew poll or the AP poll, a lot of these other polls that have come out, the Q poll, Republicans and Democrats alike, they alike believe we need to continue social distancing. We need to continue following the guidelines. We don't need to rush to reopen. There actually is a national consensus. Let me say it again. There is a national consensus among Republicans and Democrats alike, if you look at the polls over this past week, that we need to continue to social distance. We need to be responsible. And when we go back to work, we need to make sure that Americans can do it safely. So is that not, I mean, the fact that only 1 in 10 voters think that we've gone too far, is that not something to look at and say, well, in this case, it's a positive development that this pandemic has brought most Americans together, regardless of ideology?
You know, Joe, I think in so many ways the virus has thrown us into a kind of post-ideological moment where we are recognizing the emptiness, in some ways, the contradictions of the previous set of political realities. And in other words, I'm agreeing with you to a certain extent, but I think there are some underlying realities that we have to confront, and that is the growing inequality. That is that we've seen a serious attack on American higher education institutions. We could talk about that at another time. We could talk about those vulnerable folks who are living in the shadows where we've seen the erosion of a social safety net. So as great as we may think America is, the underlying fundamentals have in some ways made us vulnerable to the pandemic. And what we need in this moment, Joe, is not just simply, at least this is my view, is not just simply the kind of the resolve of the American people. We need robust imagination to respond to a crisis that has revealed the deep breakages in our society. And I think that's really important for us in this moment, Joe.
Yep.
Eddie Glaude, thank
Agreed.
you so much. And
thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.